We're just connecting now. Great, we're connected now.
Okay, we've got 3 people watching. Hello, hello audience. We'll just wait for everyone to jump across to this link before we get started. We have all panelists here waiting to answer your questions. We had a few come in over the course of the event, but if you have any more, just keep them coming in on the panel in YouTube and we'll be able to respond to them. We have some great topics and I hope you've all enjoyed the talk so far. We've got lots of, you also have lots of questions for each other, so I think you're in for a very dynamic conversation. Well, maybe we'll just get started as people start to join. Thank you very much, everyone, for your talks. I think we've really touched on a big topic from very, very different angles. So I think it's kind of fascinating to bring together science and design on this topic so that people can kind of have the everyday design sort of tangible evidence and then the more scientific evidence as well to tell the story. I'm going to jump to the first question, which is back for our first speaker, Sorcha. So Mike asks, you were saying it took some time until the 70s for the homes to modernize, as per the early advertising. Was that purely an economic infrastructural issue, the time to build differently, establish new supply chains, for example, or was there a cultural resistance to change as well?
Yeah, hi. I think it's actually a combination of the combination of two things, because on the one hand, you have a very slow increase in the economic status of Ireland during the 50s was very, very poor from an economic point of view. And it's only after you get this modernization starting in the 60s and really accelerating then that you get this increasing amount of, the fitted kitchens, all the whole thing. But also as well, there is a slow cultural change in the meaning of light and the meaning of electricity over the same time period. And it's one that starts in the late 19th century and it escalates over time, and until you get to, I'd say, probably the 80s is the point where electric light just starts to fade into the background. It becomes every day rather than something that's kind of new and interesting and exciting. And it ties in a lot of ways with sort of maybe a lag of a few years after the rural electrification scheme. The main scheme finished in the mid-60s, the post-development scheme finished in the 70s, and it's maybe sort of 10 years or so after that all of this starts to become just sort of what you expect and that what you have in the background of your life and you don't think about actively anymore. It's not an active choice, it's just something that everybody has.
Does anyone else want to come in on that, sort of the invisibility of this technology? I suppose is, is quite interesting. I suppose in terms of like becoming invisible and replacing the environment that we live in. Donal, you talked about the replicascapes, and Kristin, you mentioned the sort of early reactions to electric light replacing the sun. So I suppose there's kind of this merging of things that are visible and invisible in terms of what is natural and what isn't. So do you want to talk a bit about, how aware are we in the environment about what is real and what is natural, and how defined is that boundary? Kristin, you look poised to answer that.
I was having a thought. I don't know if it's a very good answer to the question you just posed at the end there, but I was thinking about, I work a lot, I'm a historian, as you'll have just heard, but I work a lot with chronobiologists. And one of the things they say to me is that we sort of psychologically are very bad at estimating lux levels. So our brains adjust super fast to bright light and we perceive it as something that's really normal. So I know I'll often feel like I'll look outside on a very gray day here in Copenhagen and I'll think, well, it's brighter for me inside than it is outside, but actually it's thousands of times brighter outside than it is inside. And it's sort of a strange approach. Andrew's sort of nodding. He probably has a lot more to say on this than me. But I think it's fascinating how our brains adapt to their light environments without even realizing it. And it's why I think these kind of historical moments of shock are so interesting, because so quickly we just manage to customize ourselves to whatever we're told is natural or normal, and our brain does it for us to an extent, I think.
Yeah, so maybe I can come in there, and you're dead right. If we are sitting at home and we've got our electric lights on, we're probably sitting in about 200 lux. If we go out, even in sort of late November, there's probably 3,000-4,000 lux coming up to sunset. And we don't process it. We don't perceive that difference in illumination on a conscious level. And I think that's quite important, because the studies done showing, we're talking about replacing nature with sort of man-made electricity. So the studies done, for example, in somewhere like San Diego, so in Southern California, which is probably the best climate that you could hope for. And it's found there that people, adults, working age adults, are exposed to natural sunlight for only about an hour a day. Because they're in their car, they're driving, they go to their office. So they are literally replacing bountiful natural sunlight with a man-made alternative. And a man-made alternative is not equivalent on many different levels. So I think that's a really important point to explore. And if we sort of extrapolate that question thinking, well, what we want, I think one answer to that is we want more nature, we want more sunlight, and we want more dark then to follow that. So in a way, because from a biological perspective, we are evolved over millions of years for this pattern of light and dark from sunset and sunrise. So I think that's really important, and we don't process this consciously very well at all.
Basically, we just have to get outside as much as we can, more than you realize. Yeah.
I'd just like to say, I shared an office with someone when I was working in Holland with somebody from Hawaii, and he didn't like the lights. So he'd come into the office, he'd close the blinds and turn on the fluorescence. It really hurt, because it's so rare. I mean, the climate is sort of like here. So you get a little bit of sun, it sort of really gives you a boost. Just to close the blinds and turn on fluorescence, it really made me sink inside, The other thing, just coming back earlier to, the habituation with electricity, I remember in the 70s, the power cuts, we went through a succession of those. And even in the city then, it brought home quite immediately how much you depend on light. I remember trying to do homework by candlelight. There was no TV, if anything was powered off the mains, the fridge and so on, you had to think about, where do you open the door? It just darkened the whole environment, but brought you up short. And the idea was to remind you how much you depended on the workers there. But it was interesting, just thinking back, it wasn't just in the 50s. It's that was a time when we did really appreciate when the electricity came back on. It was a gift that was being given from the unions for however long they thought they should give it for. And it did change our use of light and the oil prices. We turned off the light in government buildings, we turned off the lights in shops. I don't think there were huge increases in crime, but maybe somebody could address that.
That kind of ties into the next question, actually, in terms of, now that our environment is designed with electric light, when it disappears or we have a power cut, it's very obvious, as opposed to it might not have been earlier on. So we have a question from the audience, Jess, picking up on the impact of neon in the public realm on visual design in signs and logos. in what ways can we think about the relationship between light and design today? Lisa, you probably want to come in on that.
And unmute. I think, well, the relationship between light and design today, I suppose, is changing because so much of our street lights are actually changing. So we had a student in NCAD, for example, who was documenting the change from solar to LED lights in street lamps, because our sodium to LED, and you know, and how our whole kind of the whole color of twilight and twilight itself is kind of changing, and the kind of materiality of that is changing. And she was talking about, she's a service designer, and she was saying, so a lot of kind of wildlife that can coexist with sodium lamps will now be disappearing from cities, which I know isn't exactly about how design relates to light, but certainly we can't think of light as a stable kind of fixed thing, because the technology is changing, and then especially the infrastructure around it is changing. So I suppose in terms of, yeah, so I think just kind of acknowledging not only our places maybe becoming lit up that weren't lit before, but also the nature of that lighting changing has to be kind of taken into consideration.
Yeah, I think that's actually ties in with another question we've had around, you know, the warmer temperatures of sodium lamps, and now they're being replaced by LEDs. So we've got an example here. The High Line in New York has become quite a well-known example of subtle public lighting design, which kind of contrasts, Lisa, with what you said in your talk about, you know, the smash in the face of the environment and the introduction of electrical light in the city. So, you know, is increasing of light pollution and physical discomfort, is it being considered like legislatively and culturally? You know, how advanced is that conversation happening? Brian, you might want to come in on that, and maybe Andrew as well.
Sure, it certainly is something that's been addressed more internationally than it is here. We're pushing through Dark Skies Ireland to raise it on the agenda. We've been talking with the Road Management Office that specifies lights for councils, and also Transport Infrastructure Ireland that do the motorways. They're both very aware of trying to meet energy costs, but we've also been trying to get them to address the question of the color temperature, both within cities, because it's this increasing amount of light, and work I've done with Andrew, we find there is disturbance when light comes in through bedroom windows, for instance. But it is a topic, and we are trying to get it put on the agenda. And we've recently been working with the town of Newport and County Mayo. Mayo Council is very proactive now in the lighting situation, and interested in actually coming up with a holistic plan for Newport. So to change the light levels and to make them work together. So rather than this arms race where you put in a bright light, you have a dark shadow, you put in another bright light, and you go with whatever's available or whatever's recommended. We're actually looking at how you could paint the scene, if you like. And this is also happening in places like the UK, Bath, and another place on the border with Wales, a smaller town, you know, just to actually look at it, because things grow by piecemeal, and we do need some sort of overarching coverage or legality on it. And if you talk to the councils, you know, sometimes you'll meet sympathetic ears. Sometimes they'll say, you know, we'll do it if we have to do it, but we're not mandated. So we've been talking with government as well, and hopefully with the Green government, we can maybe push that in the agenda. If anyone is listening from the Greens, that'd be good.
I wonder about circadian lighting indoors as well, the extent to which that's something that might grow in the future. A few places experiment with it. In Denmark, there's a number of notable, usually medical facilities, hospitals, that are seeing how this improves people's physical and mental well-being. But I haven't really heard that much about it being spoken about in kind of a commercial, more general term, but perhaps other speakers have heard conversations around this.
So the airline industry has been looking at this, varying the in-cabin lighting for long-haul flights with the aim to maybe help reduce jet lag. I'm not sure it's working, and I'm not sure they've got the right end of the stick about it. But there is interest, you know, I think hospitals are really interesting examples because of places that get nearly everything wrong in terms of lighting. I mean, in terms of facilitating sleep and not facilitating sleep, and the importance that has for recovery. I think another really important point to explore with the quality of light and to understand about LED lighting in particular is that it's blue enriched. And light at the blue enriched wavelengths of visual light is the bit that specifically acts on the circadian system, what we term the non-visual light detecting system. So this is the way our brains perceive light that isn't vision. So on our circadian clocks and on other parts, we're thinking this is very important now for mood as well. And the more LED light, the more we're hitting that system, and timing is key. So it's not just the intensity of the light and the type of light, but it's when the light is presented to the observer, and that's complicated. So there isn't a simple answer. And I go to conferences and there's people from the lighting industry, and they get very frustrated because, you know, we're here saying, well, we want light here and we wanted that of this quality, but we don't want it then, and we, you know, and they go, well, what is it that you want? And unfortunately, the answer is it is complicated, and we probably need different types of light at different types of day, and that even might mean different things for different populations, or might mean something different for older adults than it does for kids. So yeah, it's complicated.
That sounds like, you know, if we're trying to design different types of light for our own homes, it sounds like, you know, we need different light bulbs for different times of the day to make sure that we're kind of following a nice pattern. I just want to jump to an idea around the hearth that Donal and Sorcha brought up, which I thought was really interesting. And you both talked about the hearth being an integral part of human existence and the need to gather for light and heat. So I guess now we have light being dispersed quite widely across our living environments where, you know, everything is quite well lit. So have we lost anything in terms of community or a need to share resources? Donal, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think the hearth is it's an interesting kind of symbol. Certainly certain types of European cultures that have sort of consolidated sort of, I suppose, how we see the world and how we use the world. So the idea of, I think the Roman hearth, the Temple of Vesta is a really interesting kind of example about labor and material and kind of ritual coming together to symbolically tie a culture together. So when the fire went out, essentially, this was a kind of harbinger of doom for the Roman Empire. And the temple as well, and if it wasn't managed properly, it was also, you know, like a blackout, you had destruction. So the Temple of Vesta burned down at least 4 times through feral sparks or mismanagement of the flame. So what's really nice about the hearth as a kind of traditional like archetype or architectural typology or design typology, that's kind of that's sort of a technical essence of something that's kind of traveled through time, is that it kind of links community and labor and kind of the idea of being sociable into one kind of legible kind of designed object that has to be maintained. It needs labor, it needs active labor to be maintained. Whereas the kind of transition into large, and it's an infrastructure, it's a very primitive infrastructure, but it's an infrastructure no less. And the transition between the hearth and the power station, for instance, is a kind of radical shift, because the idea of human labor becomes kind of less transparent, it becomes more opaque. And the idea of lighting itself becomes much more, it's taken as a more of a natural form, really. You switch it on, you switch it off. You don't think about where it comes from. It's like the sun rising, you know, in the morning, setting in the evening. It just becomes a thing that you have access to. It's a resource. But I suppose the problems when you kind of start to treat it as such is that you have these kind of, you know, knock-on effects that directly impact the natural world, the so-called natural world. I don't really believe there's a kind of a distinction between the human world and natural world. We're just kind of dominating the natural world and reshaping it on our image. And I do think, you know, I suppose for me, it's always really important to remember light is a material. it has a materiality, and the materiality is coal, it's oil, it's human labor. All of those things go into the production of artificial light. And for me, that's where the hearth is a really useful thing to kind of sort of psychically and symbolically kind of bring yourself back to, because there's an act of burning involved in creating the light. There's an act of burning involved in creating the warmth. And we're as time goes by, we're just removing ourselves from those kind of actions, but they're still happening, you know. So sorry, that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but it's go ahead, sorry.
Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to come in onto that because Donal, what other things that you're saying there are sparking ideas, and sorry, bad metaphor, sparking ideas for me as well, because it's the idea of the hearth and in terms of heat, but also light, but also the idea that it can be dangerous. It's really important that this is because what you're talking about, you know, certainly in Ireland up until sort of, you know, 50 odd 60 years ago, is people sitting around naked flames, and that it's got this element of danger to it. But as Kristin was talking about as well, you're talking about gas and gaslight also being dangerous, particularly because it is invisible. It actually naturally doesn't have a smell, but even for most of the time it gets given a smell so that you can tell if there's a gas leak. But also, like the oral history interviews that we did for the research that I was doing, was very much one of the things that came out was people being really nervous about electric light, because they were afraid of things like the sparks or the thatch going on fire, but also this connection of, well, if it's like gas, that's our reference point, you know, it's also something that's invisible that you can't see in the way that you can see a fire. You can see if it's sparking and do something about it, where it's a lot harder to do that with, you know, whether there's a live current running through something or not is nowhere near as visible. But also coming back to your question, Gael, you're asking about community. And I mean, that's one of the things that certainly in the 50s and 60s, you have this constant criticism of, and one of the downsides of electric light coming into the Irish home is the discussion about the sort of communal forms of entertainment that had existed for at least for decades, if not centuries before that, in terms of things like sitting around the fire telling stories, but also things like, you know, of visiting other people's houses in an area, but also things like dancing as well, where people would go and dance, you know, there'd be dances in people's houses, that sort of communal entertainment that goes on at night, that you might only be going to somebody, you know, 2 fields away. So it's not like there's a huge journey involved at the end of it, but that stitches a community together, that there was an awful lot of concerns about that, you know, disintegrating and falling apart. In terms of things like collecting of folklore, there's an awful lot of work being done at that time about we have to go and collect our folklore before it all dies out. And one of the documentaries that was done about rural electrification in the 90s was actually called The Death of the Banshee, where they were picking up on this idea that, you know, nobody's going to sit around and tell stories, ghost stories anymore. We'll all be watching television and not talking to each other. And it's something that you can see a similar debate going on today about the internet and about phones. The idea that, you know, we're not sitting around a fire telling stories, but there's something interesting going on where, you know, you see lots of things in newspapers where it's like, oh, everyone's in front of their phones. They're just on the train looking at their phones. They're not talking to each other. But then I guess the flip side of that is you've got, I guess, something like this, where we're actually in some ways remotely sitting around and talking about this subject, even if we're actually physically very remote, that you've got the, you know, the connection between the screens. You know?
Yeah, essentially we're kind of like rediscovering a community and rediscovering a kind of need for these things that maybe we've neglected.
I think sort of like Donal said, I think in all of these discussions, we just have to be really, I guess, suspicious of this idea of like kind of a nostalgia for the past, when we were all super in touch with nature, and that nature is something very different somehow from the world we live in now, because there are these anxieties around technology and their impacts on society that we've been, worrying about for hundreds and hundreds of years. And maybe it says something more about humans and the way we think and the way that we are sort of temporally framed, looking to the past as a way of informing how we think about things happening now. And it tends to bring just a really strong pessimism to things, which I think that it has sort of characterized almost all the talks today.
Could I just jump in there? Just coming back to this thing about the heart, or more specifically the fire, and the idea, the concept with light, it's, as Andrew has mentioned, it's the contrast. In the Mayo Dark Sky Festival, another thing we've been doing is storytelling. And being in the dark does bring a sense of bonding, because there's us and there's the surrounding. And actually telling stories by a fire under a fluorescent light is just not going to give you that. But, being together in the dark, you do feel this contact with the people beside you. And it's been reported, people have studied it in a dark sky area in Scotland, by listening in on conversations in the dark. Families will talk to each other and they've got a shared experience. And if you're out in the countryside in a way, these sort of occasions, it's a bit frowned upon to use a phone because it's actually too bright. It disturbs your night vision, which I think someone was asking earlier, is it permanently affected by being in the city? You do accommodate, you have this facility, but once you're in the dark, you adapt to it. But there's this sense of the surrounding, and it's this weird, I guess it's the psychology of it. The fire is viscerally important and gives us a center, but also just having a shared experience in the dark. There's you and there's the surroundings. But when it's dark, you are actually, and you don't use light, you're much more aware of your surroundings than if you have a torch, because it's just focusing you and wiping out everything else around you. And again, I think I touched on in my talk, just to finish, is this feeling that, if you're out, you see the stars, you feel very small in some ways, but you feel very connected in others. And again, what I enjoy most is a shared experience, even if it's cloudy or whatever. I think rather than dark skies, we're starting to talk about sky-friendly events and doing things at night. And in the citizen science work I did with Andrew, we're finding, I think about 80% of the people either were sort of interested or very interested in night-themed events, because it's, if there's a way of facilitating getting people out, it's something that people are curious about because they're not exposed to it. The light is spread into their lives, and it's seeing the other side of the coin, I think, is a useful experience, and to put us back in touch with nature, particularly, I think, around this time of COVID. I go out at night because it's quieter. It's just way too busy on the paths and trails during the daytime. But at night, you have that sense of calmness and wind down after those hectic Zoom meetings and things all day. Right.
Lisa, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I was just thinking as Brian was speaking there that in the dark, obviously, we use different senses than just our eyes, so tactile, like haptic senses or smell or whatever. And one thing that's very apparent from all these kind of all this writing about neon and electric signage I was looking at was there's a very moralizing tone about privileging vision above all else. And as I was kind of saying in the talk, sensation above reason. And I was just wondering if Kristin or Brian or anyone else has anything to say about that, light is obviously about vision, and before electric light was widespread, whether other senses you think were kind of more privileged than they might be now.
Yeah, if I just might say, it does focus you certainly on the sense of sound, because at night when it's a lot quieter and your vision, your brain can focus a bit more on the surroundings. And certainly the sense, if you're out walking or whatever, you get that scent in the evening, that sort of dampness lifts the sense up. I do think it does heighten your sense of self because of that. And I think that is playing into this thing about the relaxation, because it's putting you more in tune with your body and the surroundings. And it is very interesting in the events we've held so far over it's 5 years of the Dark Sky Festival, that, even when people come and say, well, what's the point of going to a Dark Sky Festival in Ireland because you won't see the sky? But there is something to offer in a dark environment, and then the moon comes out. I think last time we were there, November last year, you know, the moon with the clouds scudding in front of it. For people who've lived in a brightly lit city, you don't get that weird feeling with the cloud, you know, and the moon coming and going, but you are focused on the foxes and the pheasants or whatever you'll hear around twilight, you know, and for things that you haven't actually heard before so clearly. As I say, it does make you think about this is how your ancestors would have lived, and also the events we've held up at Nouth. You know, it's this weird thing of saying I can actually experience that today. It's just normally I turn it away and I don't listen to it, but I think it does center you. Maybe that's a good term, and make you think about the big picture a little bit more, and make you feel part of nature rather than something that you close the door and try and keep it outside as much as possible, even lighting up your gardens even when you're not there. You know, I think there's something to be gained by maybe a little bit of thought in post-COVID times of actually reconnecting more clearly with nature.
Oh,
Sorry, my phone went onto emergency.
it never ends. I was just thinking in terms of past people and other senses. I think undoubtedly there are sense historians who sort of think about the way people related to the world around them in the past. But certainly something I've read about is a kind of sense of embodiment in relation to the space around you that would have been very different in a period before lighting was widely available. I mean, if you've ever had to leave, you know, for work really early and you're trying not to wake up like your partner or your kids and trying to get out of the house, not like turning any lights on, you're kind of, you know, where things are in the hall kind of. But people in the past had a much stronger sense of their built environment, particularly in their homes, so they would have been able to move more easily because you sort of naturally would have had more of a feeling of things in a low light level, or your brain would have been processing that. It would have been expected to process it a little bit more often than we do now. So I think there would have been a bit more of a tactile sense in the past, which I think we all have the potential to have. It was just a bit used a bit more frequently. But of course, as I'm sort of alluding to a little bit, having to use senses like that often resulted in a lot of injuries, you know, falling downstairs or other similar things. Reasons why we have our homes bright now.
So our sense of space probably changed. You know, the way when smartphones became more widespread and people, you know, you could say they're a form of prosthetic memory. So in a way, electric light is a prosthetic navigational aid in a way. Yeah, it's really interesting. Thanks.
And the phones have really focused people about it, you know, half a meter away. And I think that's become a concern now out in the streets. You'll walk under a bus. Some places are actually marking the edges of paths just to warn people because they're looking down instead of looking up. I mean, we've got focused on the immediate, and even ignoring people around us in a city is fairly commonplace, but the phones really brought that in tight. And I think now maybe time is sort of to open up the picture a little bit more. But also, sorry, come back to the haptic again in the dark. You know, found if you go out or take the kids out, you know, just say, don't use light, feel with your feet. It's amazing how you can tell what's underfoot, with what surface you're on and whether you're on the trail or not, just by feeling, even through boots. You know, but normally, you know, we're trying to isolate ourselves. We're trying to put on good shoes and thick socks so that you don't feel anything or you don't touch anything. And I think you know, this immediacy of contact with nature should gain a little bit more primacy. Or somebody should try it at some time anyway, at least once, right?
That kind of relates to a question we had come in via Twitter. So when you were talking about closing the door on nature, or thinking about getting into the environment more, what about artificial lighting to move farming indoors? We can increase food production while leaving more land outside for nature to fill for us to enjoy. I don't know, I feel like you're going to have some things to say about that.
Yeah, the moving nature, like, so we're talking like mega farms in Holland here, like they've already done this is already happening on a kind of major scale. It's another false economy because these farms take extraordinary amounts of energy, electricity to fuel. So like the best resource we've got for growing food is the soil, like healthy soil. There's nothing better. And moving anything, there's kind of interesting things in aquaponics, hydroponics, and different types of indoor farming, but they still require a kind of, you know, quite extensive and quite consumptive energy infrastructure and different types of infrastructure to actually work. So it's still, I don't think that's quite the panacea for different types of sort of food shortages or whatever you want to call it yet. It's you kind of have to look at these things a little bit critically. Like there is a kind of a, I think it's important, you know, when we're talking about the outages earlier on, like electrical outages were a sign of, in a way, a lack of modernity. Modernity is complete control over nature and natural processes. And I would see these kind of mega farms as another aspect of that sort of obsessive need to control certain aspects of our kind of the world. So again, I'd be quite critical of those kind of, I'm fascinated by them. I must say, as an architect, they're the most alluring, amazing looking kind of structures. But yeah, I have to kind of shake myself loose and go, no, wait, there's something deeply maybe perverse about these things. Actually, just while I'm on, could I ask Kristin to elaborate a little bit more on, you may have done this and I may have just missed it, but I found it really fascinating. The Victorian Insomnia and the Victorians. Was this a shock of the new? It was like, are these the first culture to be rattled hard by the idea of kind of ubiquitous artificial lighting, or was it something else? Is it many things? But
yeah, I mean, I would say that the Victorians did face what they perceive as an epidemic of insomnia. Certainly we get the word insomnia comes from the very late 19th century. They use different words before that, like watchfulness or wakefulness. People have always struggled with sleeping. But my understanding of it is that the Victorians didn't see their insomnia as being directly caused by electricity in terms of light, although they did know that having their room being dark was important, and doctors would often say that in manuals, make sure your room is lacking in stimuli, whether that's having the curtains closed, it not being too noisy, and even having flowers in the room was deemed to be like quite overwhelming to the senses. But it was more that they felt that electricity was facilitating a world around them that in its frenetic pace was giving people insomnia by working too hard and too many hours, having a lot of worries, financial worries, being able to communicate rapidly with other people, that modernity had somehow got out of control. And electricity was a facilitator of that, but I don't think they pointed to the light pollution as the element of it that we would that we might today.
Yeah, can I jump in there to sort of expand on that, because I completely agree. So recently there's been a lot of interest in looking at sort of tribal people living very sort of hunter-gatherer type lifestyles still without any electricity, and looking at sleep in these people. And one of the really interesting things that came out from one of the studies of them, now the sleep patterns don't look that different to sort of modern sleep patterns, but when the researchers asked them about insomnia, they said, no insomnia. And it wasn't just that they didn't have the word or the phrase or an equivalent word or phrase. When the concept was explained to them, they said, no, I mean, that's bizarre. What the hell is that? So that may reflect that there is something to do with industrialization and urbanicity and all that, of which electric lighting is an integral part, but it's the overall thing that drives these sleep disturbances. And we know insomnia is really, really common. You know, about 10% of people have a chronic ongoing insomnia. And one of the interesting things, again, when we look at that, it's not just a westernized thing. You know, if we look in China, it's similar. If we look in Africa, it's similar. So there's an interplay probably between our evolutionary past and the world that we've created for ourselves that is driving this now.
There was an interesting, I read it when I was in college. It was called The Hidden Dimension. I think it was by, maybe his name was Philip Hall or something like that. He was I think he pioneered the science of haptics or something like that. I'm very, very sketchy in this. It was quite a long time ago. But he talked about how the human, for anthropologists, the human world was almost impossible to study because of obviously our time span, or our lifespan is the same as that who is studying us. So it's very hard for one person to study successive generations of any particular human habitat, but really primarily the fact that we completely reinvent our habitat almost every generation. So how do you track and kind of study human behavior over successive generations, or hundreds, if not hundreds of years, with that problem that our pair at this stage, and it is something that's picking up pace at almost every generation or every half generation. Our habitat, or how we engage with the world, is kind of transforming quite rapidly, with data infrastructure, or from the Victorians in electric lighting. So it's an interesting thing that almost talking to a tribal habitat is almost like talking to it. It's a completely different world you're talking to. Or it's a world we're so removed from in some ways. These kind of maybe sort of these other cultures, that how can we even communicate with each other about certain kind of aspects of our lives? I think that's a really interesting question. Can we even learn from each other? I don't know.
It's Edward T. Hall.
Edward T. Hall.
Yeah.
Philip Hall. Oh yeah. Okay. It's a great book, as far as I remember.
Brilliant. I kind of want to touch on a subject that we haven't really got to yet. That was kind of around the gendering of electric light, which was touched on in Sorcha and Lisa's talk, which was really interesting. So Sorcha, you mentioned that electrification was in part to sort of keep women in Ireland, and Lisa, you mentioned the nighttime was overtly designed for the female gaze and it's sensation seeking. So I'm just kind of curious, like, what role does gender have now in designing light in homes and public spaces? Lisa, do you want to come in on that first?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm teaching a module at the moment with students about, it's just called Usefulness, and I asked them to send in photos of useful, useless, misused, abused spaces near their home. And one student sent in a photo of just an alleyway beside her house, and she said, well, it's unlit, and she said, well, it's useful for everyone at certain times of day, but only certain people at other times, because it could be dangerous. So I think that, certainly in terms of maybe gender and safety, or age and safety and so on, I think obviously light is a massive part of that. So, there's a lot written after Shivel Bush about light as a form of state surveillance, as I think I referred to, but also I think just taking into consideration safety. A well-lit street with kind of eyes on the street as well means that lighting does gender in that term, or in those terms, I suppose. So that it just, it struck me this week, I was saying to the student, it'd be a really good essay if you wanted to kind of survey the alleyway and see who's in there at what times of the day, in terms of kind of maybe age, ability, and then gender, of course, as well. And because she was saying, some people can use it 24 hours or feel they can use it 24 hours of the day. And then for other people at this time of year, she was saying, some people might only use it 4 hours of the day. So I just thought that was a really good kind of summation of that.
And it's something as well that I'm just thinking about this in terms of the home as well, that one of the things that came up in about the 50s and 60s with the women that we interviewed, that they were all, or very large proportion of them, were talking about having electric light in their home meant they were able to do more work. I mean, this is kind of coming back to what Donal was talking about earlier in a way, but not in the sense of maintaining the light or maintaining the heat, but it allowed them to do other sorts of work. And I mean, a lot of what they were talking about it at a point where women were heavily discouraged, both legally and culturally, from working outside of the home still. And that having electric light in their homes meant that they could do things like piecework. There was an awful lot of textile work, so there was sort of the iron jumpers, but also like sewing and making clothes that was going on in the home at that point. That I think that sort of homework has disappeared out of a lot of people's daily lives. The idea of sort of making do and mend is a very sort of post-Second World War thing, where we're talking about, you know, a culture of consumption where we don't mend clothes or anything like that to the same extent. We go out and we buy new ones. But that what you do see happening, and what I've seen happening over like the last sort of 15, 20 years, is an increasing development of things like maker culture, and people taking things like science experiments and doing them in the home. I mean, the science gallery has been really at the forefront of this in Ireland, certainly. This whole idea of getting people to start making things, designing, crafting, working, whatever the terminology you want to use for it, but doing that in the home. And I guess it's still facilitated by electric light. So, because that's one of the things that it's kind of, it's the flip side to some of the pessimism is that it, you know, electric light or lighting in general and artificial lighting does allow for that sort of work and also education as well. So I don't know, Kirsten, looks like you've got something to add. No.
Oh, it was a question that I don't know if we know the answer to, but it was just making me think. In my talk, I mentioned briefly about the role of women as consumers in sort of the popularization of electricity in the 19th century, and the idea sort of that men can invent whatever technology they like, but if it doesn't pass muster with the women, then it's not going to be successful. It's not coming in the home. But I believe that today homes are less highly gendered spaces, where both men and women make consumer choices about the things they have around them in the home. And it just makes me think about, you know, whether lighting now and the way it's sold or designed is gendered, or if it's less gendered these days, or if we still see gender in the way that light is advertised to us.
I think a lot of it is a lot less gendered, except when you come to things like the smart home and this, you know, the smart bulbs and the smart lighting, which it's still advertised using a lot of the same sort of meanings or the same sorts of tropes that have associated with, you know, things that are seen as being high tech and are coded or stereotyped male and tied in with engineering, rather than lighting more so being part of this invisible thing that fades into the background, but also where it's being tied in with things like interior design and the choice of, you know, lampshades and the choice of where you're going to put your lamps and what shades are you going to put on, you know, if you have a light in the center of the room, and are you going to have down spots in your kitchen or anything like that, which is in itself one of the design professions that has been more female orientated or female dominated, I'd say is the probably a better term, which is all totally culturally conditioned. I mean, some of the things, as I know, historians, you know, you go back to the 19th or the 18th century, and the job of the person in the home to decorate it is the man, it's a gentleman. Whereas you get the Victorians, that all shifted over, and it hasn't really shifted as far back yet as it could. But the whole thing about it is that it is movable and it is shiftable, and it's not an absolute, it's only tied culturally, not biologically, to one gender.
It's a really interesting point. Does anybody else want to come in on that? Or I just saw the time there. We're almost approaching an hour actually. So I know that you guys have a lot more interesting things to say. Does anybody want to touch on any topics that we haven't covered yet before we close?
I just think referring back is worth reiterating the concept of moving agriculture indoors, and the Netherlands. That is a country which has big problems with the greenhouses and light pollution. They're forbidden to to vent them until after midnight when people are in bed. But the other thing is that those countries that are in that area actually have had a huge crash in their insect populations, and they have trouble getting pollination. So bringing things indoors does pose problems. But again, we need to look in a holistic way. You know, we might want more light, but what effect does it have on, you know, the type of light and the intensity of light and the directionality of light have on the environment? And they've even found in studies in the States, I think it was at a university undergrad level, but the types of weeds that grow under particular lights changes as you change the light source. And that has knock-on effects then on pollination and so on. And just to come back to something I mentioned in the talk, you know, in the era of climate change, and especially living on an island, we're continually adding stressors, just as with COVID, then you have online meetings is another stressor on our working day, and extends our working day, where that's mediated or facilitated by having light and electricity. So, you know, there's an additional stressor on the environment, which is passed on through the use of light or the excessive use of light. And because, just to refer back again, with lighting technology changing, we have this issue that it's cheap to produce light. So we're seeing light turning up in other areas, such as around bridges and so on, and shining in the water and affecting the fish. You know, that this ubiquity, or this assumption that, you know, if it's cheap enough, we can make a lot of it. I think, you know, we're slowly beginning to realize that it's a zero-sum game. So there's a cost. The same way as if we could produce a lot more cheaper plastic nowadays, I think we'd think about whether that was a good idea. So I think we should also think about whether producing more light is a good idea. It's all right to use it where we need it, but in excessive quantities, it does have a very important impact in a much wider area and a much wider habitat.
I think that's a really nice conclusion to all of your talks, where it's bringing much more like conscientiousness around how we apply electric light and different light sources in our daily lives, and also in policy. Maybe policymakers need to draw more from maybe design and science in terms of designing the future and how we use electric light as a resource in life and in food production and all sorts of facets. So I might call for a close there. Thank you so much to all our speakers for a fantastic afternoon. I just wanted to highlight one of our comments came in from Jess Magiconomy saying, I'm really noticing how the light has been changing at the location of the speakers as we've gone through the symposium this afternoon. Very apt. And actually, this was a conscientious decision on our part to maybe make a sort of subliminal highlight of what we're talking about here today. So thank you very much to the audience as well, and also thank you to the Design History Society and Science Gallery for collaborating on this event, and especially to Jane Gleason for all the behind the scenes production is invaluable. So thank you very much to all our speakers, and enjoy the rest of the day, everyone. Make sure you conscientiously choose your lights.